Welcome to this live read of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh by Robert C. O'Brien. Today we'll be reading chapters 14 and 15 from the book. Okay, let's begin. Chapter 14, The Marketplace. Mrs. Frisby's head was buried in her arms. "I never knew," she said. "All I knew was that he didn't come back. But I never knew what happened. I didn't even know he knew you. Why didn't he ever tell me?" Justin touched her shoulder gently. "It's hard for you to learn it this way, so suddenly. We thought about telling you when it happened, but we decided we shouldn't. It wouldn't have done any good." "You ask why Jonathan never told you about us," Nicodemus added. "He had a reason, a good one. Still, he worried about it a lot, and he might have told you in the end, but then it was too late." "What was the reason?" Mrs. Frisby raised her face. There were tears on her cheeks, but she had stopped crying. "To answer that, I would have to tell you quite a long story. The whole story about us, and Nimh, and Jonathan, and how we came here. He came with us, you see. I don't mind doing that, but I don't know if there is time now." "I don't think there is," said Justin. "If Mr. Ages and I go to get the powder, and you're telling it—" "Ugh, with this leg," said Mr. Ages glumly, "that will take long enough for you to tell it twice." "I had forgotten," said Justin contritely. "Would it be better if I went alone?" "No," said Mr. Ages. "There are so many different potions in my storeroom, you wouldn't know which to bring back. I'll go with you, but we'll go slowly." "And I," said Arthur. "We'll see about the equipment for tonight. We'll need shovels, crowbars, block and tackle, rollers." He left, still listing tools. Nicodemus said to Mrs. Frisby, "I think that we too should leave the library. There'll be others coming in, like Isabella, to practice reading, and some to do research." "Research?" "We've got some new books on agriculture, farming, gardening, fertilizing, things like that, and we're studying them. It's all part of the plan." I don't know what the plan is." "No," agreed Nicodemus, "but when I've told you our story, you'll understand that too." He opened the door and led Mrs. Frisby down the corridor past several more doors, all closed. He stopped before one, which he opened. "My office," he said. "Please, come in." The room she entered was smaller than the library, but much more comfortable, almost elegantly furnished. There was a rug on the floor, the same pattern she noticed as the carpet in the hallway above, a light recessed in the ceiling, and another in the wall next to a table. There were bookshelves. On one shelf an electric clock hummed quietly to itself. A book lay open on the table, with a chair in front of it. Against the opposite wall stood a small sofa, neatly upholstered in cloth. But what attracted Mrs. Frisby's attention most was a box in one corner of the room, a box with dials and a small light shining on the front. From this box came the soft sound of music. She listened, entranced. "You like music?" said Nicodemus. "So do I." "That must be a radio." Again, something vaguely remembered from what Jonathan had once told her. Music. She had heard it only 2 or 3 times in her life, when the Fitzgibbons had left a window open and someone was playing inside, and never up close. It was a lovely sound. "Yes," said Nicodemus, "we didn't get it for music, of course, but to hear the news. Still, as long as it's here, why not use it?" He sat down, and so did Mrs. Frisby. "Now," he said, "I will tell you about Nimh. You'll be interested, I think, because your husband was part of it, and when I'm finished, I think you will see why he felt he could not tell you himself." "The story begins," Nicodemus continued, "not at Nimh, but at a marketplace on the edge of a big city. It was called the Farmers' Market, a great square of a place with a roof over part of it and no walls to speak of. There early every morning the farmers arrived from all over the surrounded countryside, with trucks full of tomatoes, corn, cabbages, potatoes, eggs, chickens, ham, and food for the city. One part of it was reserved for the fishermen who brought crabs and oysters and bass and flounders. It was a fine place, noisy and full of smells. We lived near this market, my mother, my 9 sisters and brothers, and I, underground in a big pipe that had once been part of a storm sewer, but was no longer used. There were hundreds of other rats in the neighborhood. It was a rough life, but not so hard as you might think, because of the market. Every evening at 5 o'clock, the farmers and the fishermen would close up their stalls, pack their trucks, and go home. At night, hours later, the clean-up men would arrive with brooms and hoses. But in between, the market was ours, and the food the farmers left behind, peas and beans that fell from the trucks, tomatoes and squashes, pieces of meat and fish trimmed as waste. They lay on the sidewalks and in the gutters. They filled great cans that were supposed to be covered, but seldom were. There was always 10 times more than we could eat, and so there was never any need for fighting over it. Fighting? Oh, quite the contrary. The marketplace was a perfect place for playing, and so we did, the young rats at least, as soon as we had finished eating. There were empty boxes for hide and seek. There were walls to climb, tin cans to roll, and pieces of twine to tie and swing on. There were even, in the middle of the square, a fountain to swim in when the weather was hot. Then, at the first clang of the clean-up men in the distance, one of the older rats would sound a warning, and everyone would pick up as much food as he could carry home. All of us kept a reserve supply, because some days, Sundays and holidays, the market would be closed, and we were never quite sure when this would happen. When I went to the market, it was usually with 2 companions, my older brother, Gerald, and a friend of mine named Jenner. These were my 2 closest friends. We liked the same games, the same jokes, the same topics of conversation, even the same kind of food. I particularly admired Jenner, who was extremely quick and intelligent. One evening in early fall, Jenner and I set out for the marketplace. It must have been September, for the leaves were just turning yellow, and some children were throwing a football in a vacant lot. Gerald had to stay home that night. He had caught a cold, and since the air was chilly, my mother thought that he should not go out. So Jenner and I went without him. I remember we promised to bring him back some of his favorite food, beef liver, if we could find any. We took our usual route to the market, not along the streets, but through the narrow walkways between the buildings, mostly commercial warehouses and garages that bordered the square. As we walked, we were joined by more rats. At that time of day, they converged on the marketplace from all directions. When we reached the square, I noticed that there was a white truck of an odd square shape parked on the street bordering it, perhaps a block away. I say I noticed it, but I did not pay any particular attention to it, for trucks were common enough in that part of town. But if I had, I would have noticed that printed on each side of it were 4 small letters. Nimh. I would not have known what they were, of course, for at that time neither I nor any of the other rats knew how to read. It was growing dark when we reached the market, but through the dusk we could see that there was an unusually large supply of food, a great mound of it near the center of the square, away from the roofed-over portion. I suppose that should have served as a warning, but it didn't. I remember Jenner saying, "They must have had a really busy day." And we ran joyfully toward the pile, along with several dozen other rats. Just as we reached the food, it happened. All around us there was suddenly shouting. Bright, blinding searchlights flashed on, aimed at us and at the mound of food, so that when we tried to run away from it, we couldn't see where we were going. Between and behind the lights there were shadows moving swiftly, and as they came toward us, I could see that they were men in white uniforms carrying nets, round nets with long handles. "Look out!" cried Jenner. "They're trying to catch us!" He darted in one direction, I in another, and I lost sight of him. We all ran straight toward the men with the nets. There was no other way to run. They had us encircled. The nets flailed down, scooped, and flailed again. I suppose some rats made it through, slipping between the men and past the lights. I felt a swish, a net that just missed me. I turned and ran back toward the mound, thinking I might hide myself inside it. But then came another swish, and that time I felt the enveloping fibers fall over me. They entangled my legs, then my neck. I was lifted from the ground along with 3 other rats, and the net closed around us. Chapter 15. In the Cage. Mrs. Frisby said, "But why did they want to catch you? And how did you ever get away again?" "At first," said Nicodemus, "I thought it must be because they didn't like our stealing the food. And yet you could hardly even call it stealing. It was waste food. All they did with it was haul it away to the city incinerator. So what harm would it be if we ate some of it? Of course, there are some people who just dislike rats, whether they're doing any harm or not." "And mice, too," said Mrs. Frisby. "True," said Nicodemus. "Though not so much as rats, I think. Anyway, that wasn't the reason at all. But what the real reason was, I didn't find out for a while. As to getting away, that too didn't happen until much later. No, I was firmly and inextricably caught, snared in the net and helpless. When the man who held it saw that he had 4 rats, he pulled a drawstring that closed it up. He put the net down and picked up another, an empty one. He moved on into the square, leaving us to lie there. I tried gnawing my way out, but the strands were made of some kind of plastic, as hard as wire. The noise and movement began to lie down eventually. I suppose the rats in the square had all either been caught or had escaped. I heard one man call to another, "I guess that's the lot." Someone else was turning a light this way and that, searching the rest of the market area. "Not a one to be seen." "We could hide and wait for another wave." There won't be another wave, not tonight. Probably not for 4 or 5 nights. Word gets around." "You mean they communicate?" A third voice. "Oh, you bet they communicate. And the next time they do come, you can be sure they'll case the place carefully. We were lucky. These rats hadn't been bothered for years. They grew careless." "How many did the lab order?" Somebody was turning out the lights one at a time. 5 dozen. How many have we got?" About that, maybe more." "Let's load the truck." In a minute or so, I felt myself being lifted up and swinging back and forth in the net. I was carried with my 3 companions to the white truck I had seen earlier. Its back doors were open, and it was lit inside. I could see that its whole interior was a large wire cage. Into this our net was thrown, and the man that opened the drawstring, and we were dumped onto the floor, which was covered with sawdust. The other nets were emptied one at a time the same way. In a few minutes there was a good-sized crowd of us on the floor, all more or less dazed and terrified. The cage was locked, the doors clanged shut, and the lights went out. I heard the truck motor start. A second later the floor lurched beneath me. We were moving. Where were they taking us? For what purpose? Then, in the dark, I heard a voice beside me. "Nicodemus!" It was Jenner. You can imagine how glad I was to hear him, but I was sorry, too. "Jenner, I thought maybe you got away." "I was in the last net. I thought I saw you across the floor." "Where are we going?" "I don't know." "What's a lab?" "A laboratory." "Yes, I know, but what is it?" "I don't know. I've just heard that word somewhere." "I think that's where we're going, whatever it is." The truck rumbled along through the dark, over bumpy streets at first, and then at a higher speed over a smooth highway. There were no windows in the back, so it was impossible to see where we were going. Not that I would have known anyway, never before having more than 6 blocks from home. I thought we drove for about 2 hours, but it might have been less before the truck slowed and turned and finally came to a stop. The back doors were opened again, and through the wire wall of the cage I saw that we had come to a building, very modern, of white cement and glass. It was square and big, about 10 stories tall. Night had fallen, and most of its windows were dark, but the platform to which our truck drove us was lit, and there were people waiting for us. A door opened and 3 men came out. One of them pushed a cart, a hand truck piled with small wire cages. The man beside him was dressed in a heavy coat, boots, and thick leather gloves. The third man wore heavy horn-rimmed glasses and a white coat. He was obviously the leader. The men from the truck, the ones who had caught us, now joined the men from the building. "How many did you get?" asked the man in the white coat. "Hard to count, they keep moving around, but I make it between 60 and 70. "Good. Any trouble?" "No, it was easy. They acted almost tame." "Oh, I hope not. I've got enough tame ones." "Oh, they're lively enough. They look healthy." "Well, let's get them out." The man with the gloves and the boots then donned a wire face mask as well and climbed in among us. He opened a small sliding trap door at the back of our cage. A man outside held one of the small cages up to the opening, and one at a time we were pushed out into our each individual little prisons. A few of the rats snarled and tried to bite. I didn't, and neither did Jenner. It was too obviously futile. When it was finished, the man in the white coat said, 63. Good work. A man from the truck said, "Thanks, Dr. Schultz," and we were racked on the hard truck and wheeled into the building. Dr. Schultz. I did not know it then, but I was to be his prisoner and his student for the next 3 years. We spent the rest of that night in a long white room. It was in fact a lab, with a lot of equipment at one end that I didn't understand at all then, bottles and shiny metal things and black boxes with wires trailing from them. But our end held only rows and cages on shelves, each cage with a tag on it, and each separated from its neighbors by a wooden partition on both sides. Someone came around with a stack of small jars and fastened one to my cage. A little pipe led through to the bar, like a sipping straw. It was drinking water. Then the lights were dimmed, and we were left alone. That cage was my home for a long time. It wasn't uncomfortable. It had a floor of some kind of plastic, medium soft and warm to the touch, with wire walls and ceiling. It was airy enough. Yet just the fact that it was a cage made it horrible. I, who had always run where I wanted, could go 3 hops forward, 3 hops back again, and that was all. But worse was the dreadful feeling, I knew we all had it, that we were completely at the mercy of someone we knew not at all. For some purpose we could only guess. What were their plans for us? As it turned out, the uncertainty itself was the worst suffering we had to undergo. We were treated well enough, except for some very small, very quick flashes of pain, which were part of our training. We were always well fed, though the food, scientifically compiled pullets, was not what you'd call delicious. But of course we didn't know that when we arrived, and I doubt that any of us got much sleep that first night. I know I didn't. So in a way, it was a relief when early the next morning the lights snapped on and Dr. Schultz entered. There were 2 other people with him, a young man and a young woman. Like him, they were dressed in white lab coats. He was talking to them as I entered the room and walked toward our cages. 3 groups, 20 for training on injection series A, 20 on series B. That will leave 23 for this control group. They get no injections at all, except to keep the test exactly even, we will prick them with a plain needle. Let's call the groups A, B, and C for control. Tag them and number them, A1 through A20, B1 through B20, and so on. Number the cages the same way. Keep each rat in the same cage throughout. Diet will be the same for all. When do we start the injections? As soon as we're through with the tagging. We'll do that now. George, number the tags and the cages. Julie, tie them on. I'll hold. So the young woman's name was Julie. The young man was George. They all put gloves on. long, tough, plastic ones that came to their elbows. One by one, we were taken from our cages, held gently but firmly by Dr. Schultz, while Julie fastened each one of our necks a narrow ribbon of yellow plastic bearing a number. I learned eventually that mine was number A10. They were kind, especially Julie. I remembered that when one rat was being tagged, she looked at it and said, "Oh, poor little thing. He's frightened. Look how he's trembling." "What kind of biologist are you?" said Dr. Schultz. "The poor little thing is a she, not a he." When my turn came, the door of my cage slid open just enough for Dr. Schultz to put his gloved hand through. I cowered in the back of the cage, which was just what he expected me to do. One hand pressed me flat against the wire wall, and then his fingers gripped my shoulders. The other hand held my head just behind the ears, and I was powerless. I was lifted from the cage and felt the plastic collar clipped around my neck. I was back inside with the door closed in less than a minute. The collar wasn't tight, but by no amount of tugging, twisting, or shaking was I ever able to get it off. I watched through the wire front of my cage as the others were caught and tagged. About 6 cages down from me, on the same shelf, I saw them put a collar on Jenner. But once he was back in the cage, I could see him no longer. A little later in the morning, they came around again, this time pushing a table on wheels. It was loaded with a bottle of some clear liquid, a long rack of sharp needles, and a plunger. Once more, I was lifted from the cage. This time George did the holding, while Dr. Schultz fastened one of the needles to the plunger. I felt a sharp pain in my hip, and then it was over. We all got used to that, for from now on we got injections at least twice a week. What they were injecting and why, I did not know. Yet for 20 of us, those injections were to change our whole lives. Well, that's the end of that chapter, so that's where we're going to leave it for today. Come back on Monday at 1:30. We'll read the next 2 chapters of the book. Hope you enjoyed this reading, and I hope you get outside and enjoy the beautiful day that we have. And I hope you're staying safe and healthy. I'll see you on Monday.